All right, looks like we are good. I know we had just a little bit of an audio issue there. So my fantastic team got that all working. If you missed anything from the introduction, well, all I was at least was saying is welcome. And of course, I was introducing you to a lot of the other expertise, all those experts you're seeing there in the chat. Hopefully that gave you some time to look over the objectives for this session so you have a pretty good understanding of what you'll get out of this next hour plus session. You'll see here that we're going to tackle some of those topics from each of those 4 multiple choice tests. We'll be looking at standards of English for the English test. We're going to cover some geometry and algebra rules for the math test. You'll be able to understand what we mean when we say look for the main idea in the reading test, and finally you will know how to analyze the types of charts and graphs that you will see on the science test. Now, all of that is going to hopefully give you the question of how can I continue to unlock my ACT potential with ACT Kaplan Online Prep Live. We'll have some information for you about that at the end. All right, well, it looks like no one got to hear any of my introductions earlier, so I just want to go ahead and welcome you once again to ACT Kaplan Online Prep Live. I'm Kaplan instructor Stephanie, and I also want to give a big warm welcome to my fantastic colleagues who, in fact, were helping us out with that audio issue earlier. We have Arthur, who's just behind the wings. We've got Joe, Kieran, and Katie, who are all there in the chat, making sure all of your questions get addressed. And also, I wanted to point out that we do have a moderated chat, and Beth is there reading every single one of your chats that you send to us. If you don't see your chat appear in the chat proper, it could just be because there's just a lot of responses that are very similar, especially if I ask a question and all of you are getting the answer identically correct. So don't worry about that. Every single one of your chats we do see, and we aren't ignoring you, so there's no reason to send something like, send this through, approve this, because well, that's not really going to contribute much to our chat discussion, so don't worry. It's all there, and as Beth promises, we are reading everything that you write. All right, so let's talk about that very first test that you're going to see on test day. That is the English test. Go ahead and tell me there in the chat, what are some things that you already know? You already know this about the ACT English test. I know quite a few of you are taking the ACT this weekend. This is the week leading up to test day for those of you taking the September ACT. So particularly for those of you who are just a few days out, you'll have a pretty good understanding of, what to expect. So a couple of things that you can definitely expect here. It's going to be standardized. So 45 minutes long. This is broken down into 5 passages of 15 questions apiece. Add all that together, and you're going to get a total of 75 questions. Now, there's no point to sitting there thinking, this means I have like X 0.5 seconds to answer each question. What you do want to think about in terms of pacing is how you break it down by passage. So you have roughly 9 minutes to spend on each passage. Now, some passages may go a little bit faster, some may go a little bit slower. But the point here is that accuracy. Yeah, accuracy is what's going to help you out on test day. If you're rushing, if you're going too quickly, you're going to potentially make some silly mistakes or miss some information that you would have otherwise been able to get. So speed is important, but accuracy is more important. So think about that for the win. Now, some of you said, I'm a little bit nervous about my pacing, I'm a little bit nervous about my timing. Keep in mind that you are likely, when you get that time warning on test day, when your proctor gives you, hopefully your proctor gives you a 5-minute warning. Some proctors may give you a 10-minute warning. Particularly if you hear a 10-minute warning, it's absolutely okay if you're not on that last passage, because look, you have on average 9 minutes to spend on a passage, and you should likely be, not that far into that last passage when you hear that warning, generally speaking. Now, I see Susan says there's a lot of questions based on commas. A lot of you, in fact, are talking about some of the conventions of English that are tested. Colin says the English test involves rules like grammar. A lot of you are mentioning commas here. Yes. And I like what Pramod says, which is don't overuse the comma. In fact, that's the main punctuation mark that we're going to review right now, because the comma is frequently tested and, in fact, frequently misused, overused, abused, both on test day and often in our everyday writing. So we want to make sure that we're not going to do that. So there's a variety of topics here. The strategy is going to be the same regardless of the type of passage you're reading, regardless of the style of the passage, whether it's a narrative, whether it's an argumentative passage, you're still going to be wanting to focus on the same few elements. Now, some questions are going to ask about a particular underlined section. Those tend to be the questions that are asking you about the more conventions, punctuation, word choice style questions. Others are going to ask you about the passage as a whole, or a paragraph or a sentence as a whole. And those questions can dig into not only things like grammar and punctuation, but also topics like organization, main idea. Is it relevant? Does it actually belong? Is it on topic or is it off topic? How does it work to transition between two paragraphs, or to transition into the main idea as a topic sentence or between two ideas? So while a good number of questions, in fact, the majority of the English test is in fact dealing with conventions of standard English, punctuation, subject-verb agreement, verb tense, commas, all that type of stuff, you will also have questions that ask you about knowledge of language and how you write. So this knowledge of language, we're talking about wordiness, redundancy, being precise with the word choice. And when we're talking about production of writing, we're talking about the elements of writing that you hopefully are using in your own writing to make it clear and organized for the reader. Are you using transition words? Are you only including information that's relevant? Are you being redundant? Are things kind of out of place, or do you have a nice logical flow? So you're also going to see those types of questions on test day as well. Now, we have on ACT Kaplan Online Prep Live sessions that go into each of these categories in depth. We're just going to cover 2 topics here today in our sample lesson, but if you are looking for more, if you're like, wow, I wish I could take an entire lesson on just punctuation, or what do you mean by production of writing? I don't really know what that means. I wish I could dig deeper into that. Guess what? We've got you covered with ACT Kaplan Online Prep Live. But for now, let's talk about everyone's favorite punctuation mark, which is the comma. Go ahead and tell me in the chat, when do you know to use a comma? What are some of the roles of the comma that you are already familiar with? Maybe you're already including them in your own writing. Maybe you've seen them either tested this way correctly if you've taken an ACT practice test, or maybe you've taken the ACT before. Or maybe it's an error that you've seen that you've had to correct with regards to comma usage. I know Rachel gives us one, which is a list. And I see she also is saying list here as well. Now that's just a more colloquial way of saying what I've got here up on the screen, which is to separate elements in a series. Well, this is just a fancy fangled way of saying, yeah, you're making a list. So when we're talking about a list, we're talking about a list of 3 or more. If we're just listing 2 things, then we would just say thing A and thing B. There's no reason to put a comma in between. But let's take a look at this sentence right here. At the concert, I ran into my parents, Drake and Nicki Minaj. Now, I want you to assess the list that I have here and tell me in the chat, what happened at this concert? Because I definitely have 1 comma that's separating things in my list. And for those of you, maybe you have, there's some kind of funny little pictures that sometimes float around the internet with regards to comma usage. There's also sometimes debate about, what is the Oxford comma or the serial comma? Should you use it? Should you not? But let's take a look at this. As written, what happened at this concert? I ran into 2 people, and these 2 people were my parents. I am implying that my parents are Drake and Nicki Minaj. Now, Susan says, I wish my parents were Drake and Nicki Minaj. Yeah, I don't know how I would possibly be the byproduct of that coupling. But anyway, if you do not put a comma before the and, then I'm saying that I only ran into 2 people. Now, if I'm saying this, my parents are probably not Drake and Nicki Minaj. Honestly, I don't even know if Nicki's old enough to be my mother. Good for her. She's looking great if she is old enough to be my mother. But I probably ran into 4 people, right? Rather than this being like a super awesome reunion with my parents, it was probably a little bit more awkward when I was so excited to run into Drake and Nicki Minaj, and then my parents also showed up into the picture. So we want to make sure that when you're separating those elements in a list, you always want to put that comma before the and as well. So on test day, if you see a comma before the and, it could be that it's being used as an Oxford comma. Anne has a great kind of recap of this in the chat. The Oxford comma is missing to make it clear that Drake, the parents, and Nicki Minaj are all different people. Absolutely. Now, of course, we could see another example of this in perhaps a less exciting sentence. My most interesting classes this year are physics, comma, calculus, comma, and U.S. history. So again, even though there isn't, a lot of room for misinterpretation in this example here, you want to make it good standard practice to include that comma just in case there is, and you're going to see that comma on test day. All right, so that is comma rule number 1. All right, let's take a look at our second comma rule. I saw some of these also presented here in the chat, which is use a coordinating conjunction. And I know I saw it earlier. I apologize, I missed who said it, but fanboys. Yeah, we want this fanboys word. Now, if you're like, fanboys, what about these fangals? As Hafsa said, after using this with the fanboys, this is those coordinating conjunctions. Now, fanboys is just an acronym. It stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And this will disappear off your screen a little bit, but I know one of my phenomenal colleagues will have that in the chat for you to go ahead and grab. So sorry, ladies, there's no like fangals just because there is no good coordinating conjunction word that starts with a G or an L for that matter. But what we see here is on both sides of the comma fanboys conjunction, you will have a complete sentence. So let's look at this. So here's my comma, and there's my fanboys. And in this case, I'm using an and. So everything on one side of this should be able to stand alone as a complete sentence. And we see that, right? I work on Mondays, period. Full stop. Like that could be a sentence. And over here, this could also be a complete sentence. I have soccer practice on Tuesdays, period. Full stop. We're good to go. So when you're using one of these coordinating conjunctions, both sides before the comma, so everything before the comma, and everything after the conjunction word should be able to stand alone as a complete sentence. We call those independent clauses because they can be independent, out and about without any sort of other words to help them out. So I'm going to kind of summarize this as IC for independent clause, comma fanboys, and then another independent clause. So that is your comma rule number 2. Now I've got a couple other comma rules that we have to deal with here as well. One other is to add in this parenthetical information. So this is if you might describe this as extra information. You might describe this as some fluff, if you will. But let's take a look at this term non-essential. Because I found that sometimes when I say the word non-essential, it almost makes you think not important. And then you have to start making some value judgments, right? Like, what is important? Do I think this belongs here? And now here's the deal. Like on test day, I don't want you to have to be thinking, right? I want you to be going in there automatically and being like, I know this is the rule. I know this is what I do. I'm going to bubble this and I'm going to move on. We shouldn't have to be like, in my own opinion, does this matter? Because, the truth of the matter is your opinion doesn't have any place in the ACT itself. So when we're talking about non-essential, and again, I'm going to put this down here. Non-essential means not essential to the structure of the sentence. What this means is that you could take these words out and still have a complete sentence. Notice how that is not open to interpretation, right? That is that is a black and white rule. Like either it is a sentence or it's not a sentence. Like there is no, do I think it's a sentence? in my opinion, is it a sentence? Like, it's either going to be a sentence or it's not going to be a sentence. So let's look at these two commas here. My colleague Boris, who's also one of our instructors here at ACT Online Pilot, likes to call this a comma sandwich. I like to think of it as scissors. Like, I like to think that you kind of take some scissors and like clip it right there where those commas are, and you clip it and you just grab it and drag it out of there. So clip it, cut it out, there we go, cover it up. And now we have to ask ourselves, do we have a complete sentence here without this information? Azara found that the hours she spent studying were worth the effort. And in this case, we do. Notice how that can be a complete sentence. So that is non-essential. It doesn't mean it wasn't important or useful, but what it means is we didn't have to have it there in order to have a complete sentence. Now, just a little heads up, because in just a moment we're going to talk about subject-verb agreement. Often you're going to see the subject on one side of this kind of non-essential information that's offset by commas, and you're going to have the verb on the other side. So it kind of creates some distance there. When you see the non-essential information, even if it's not a question that's testing commas, still remember you can basically just cross it out of that sentence and everything will go along as planned, which means that might help you match up that subject with that verb a little bit better. All right, and now our fourth role of the comma here is to set up an introductory or modifying phrase. And now these modifying phrases, notice how a complete sentence they do not make, right? After school, that's not a complete sentence. So we have like a dependent clause here, and then we have a comma, and then everything after that comma is an independent clause, right? Mindy has to go straight to band practice. Like, that can stand alone by itself. And this modifying or introductory phrase, it modifies the very next word that you see. So who's doing this after school? It's Mindy. So something I noticed earlier in the chat, someone mentioned, like there's a misplaced modifier. You could potentially have really, interesting sentences if you were to read them literally, if you had the wrong word coming right here. Like if we said after school, band practice is attended by Mindy. Well, then we're saying that the band practice does this after school, which would be, band practice isn't going anywhere. Band practice is not going to school. So you could potentially have some interesting sentences there. All right, let's apply what we just talked about with commas to a test-like question with question number 1. Now, Joe's got a poll open for you. So no spoilers in the chat, please. If you put a spoiler in the chat, Beth is not going to let it through. I can guarantee that right now. And then we will discuss question number 1. Once you have answered this one, I'll be quiet to give you a second to do it in just a moment. Tell me in the chat, what was this comma doing? Take a moment for question 1. All right, so when we see a comma underlined on test day, the first thing you want to ask yourself is this comma doing one of our comma roles? And remember, we have 4 comma roles. We have lists, we have independent clause, comma fanboys, independent clause. We have, non-essential info, and we have this dependent clause, comma, independent clause. Now, I saw someone ask in the chat, so commas connect to independent clauses. No, they don't. In fact, I'm going to put that up right here. So independent clause, comma, independent clause with no coordinating conjunction. This is a very particular error that you will often see on test day. In fact, I want to cross it out, but I also want you to be able to see what it is so that if you're taking notes, you can do this. This is called a comma splice. So you don't want these to be there on test day. All right, so you cannot use a comma to combine 2 complete sentences. You cannot do it. So in this case, let's assess what we have on each side of this comma. Well, we don't have a list, right? I look at this and I'm like, do I have a list? When, causes? No. Okay, so I have no list. I don't have a fanboys word. So it's not this because I don't have a conjunction. Do I have non-essential info? Well, I don't have another comma. So without two commas, I can't offset non-essential information either. So the only one I'm left testing is dependent clause, independent clause. Well, this is definitely not a complete sentence, right? The greater the pressure from the wind, dun, 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 like I've got no idea here, right? This is not an independent clause. We don't have a complete sentence. Now, if we have an independent clause on the other side that this tends to be describing, we might be okay. But causes bonds to form, like this is also not a complete sentence. What we have here is some other dependent clause. So we don't have an independent clause, which means we can definitely not do answer choice A. Now, looking down here at the poll, I see the other answer choice we were leaning towards, if it wasn't A, was B. So let's take a look at B. The pressure from the wind, again, this was a dependent clause, but which causes the bonds to form? That's still another dependent clause. We still have dependent clause, dependent clause. We have to have one of the sides on this comma has to be a standalone sentence or it won't work. I see in the poll, we're not liking answer choice C. What we're left with is answer choice D. In fact, we don't need any commas here. We just have one complete sentence. The greater pressure from the wind causes bonds to form. Now I actually know what's going on here. And then we have some more detail. It's more quickly, blah, 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 blah. So whenever you see a comma underlined, if you know these 4 comma rules, you can, in fact, just, kind of check them off. Is it doing this? No. Is it doing this? No. Is it doing that? No. Is it? Okay, well, if it's not doing any of them, then it shouldn't be a comma. So get rid of it. Now I'm seeing the question about lots of other punctuation marks. Again, we have sessions we have an entire lesson, 2 entire lessons actually, on conventions of standard English in our ACT Online Prep Live courses. So there's an entire lesson just on punctuation. If you're like, but my favorite punctuation mark is not the comma. I love the dash, or I love the semicolon. And guess what? We've got you covered with lessons on just that. Now, earlier I saw a question in the chat, like, can you define subject-verb agreement? And yes, I can. I'm going to do it right now. So when we're talking about subject-verb agreement, we're talking about how you conjugate the verb. Now, if you're a native English speaker, you may not have thought about this until you started taking a second language in high school. Of course, if you've studied English as your second language, then you probably have a little bit, you have probably thought about conjugating subject verbs in English as opposed to whatever your native language is. For whatever reason it is, and it's likely because, well, we learn a lot of this by ear as we're learning language. We don't necessarily think about conjugation in our primary language. But for those of you who maybe have taken Spanish classes or French classes, you have to kind of write like I am, you are, he, she, they, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about subject verb agreement. Right? I am playing golf, you are playing golf, they are playing golf, who is playing golf, So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about whether I am playing golf or I are not playing golf. So that's what I mean by subject verb agreement. So you have to match this up in first person, second person, third person, and also in number. So she works hard, they work hard, right? She work hard, they works, no. So you can have singular must match up with a singular conjugation, and plural must match up with plural. Now, by and large, your ears do tend to tell you when these are incorrect most of the time when the words are right next to each other. All right, because if I say they am playing golf, you're going to look at that and be like, no, change it right away. But what I mentioned earlier is when you have those non-essential clauses kind of in between a sentence, sometimes the subject isn't right next to the verb, in which case your ears might not pick up on it. So you always have to use your eyes, and this applies for every grammar question on the ACT. Always verify with your eyes and with your brain, rather than relying on your ears, because often our ears will say things are okay because they don't sound wrong, but when they're written, they are in fact incorrect. So to that end, let's apply that hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge to question number 2. And once you've answered this, I want you to tell me in the chat, what is our subject? That's what I'm looking for. Now, if you're just reading this, you might have said ocean waves, have become, and your ears are like, ding, ding, ding. That sounds great. Waves have become difficult, but hold on a minute. What is becoming increasingly difficult? It is a fuel deposit. Nice, exactly. Suja, Pramath, Hafsa, Arya, yeah. A fuel deposit is just one. So a fuel deposit has become increasingly difficult. Now, we're using these 2 dashes much like you'd use 2 commas. So when you have 2 dashes, just like 2 commas, you can take all that out because it's just non-essential stuff. And now we have a fuel deposit of truly game-changing size has become increasingly difficult. So this is what I mean by sometimes you've got to look for what is the subject and to match it up. Nicely done. All right, now tell me in the chat, after the English test, what is the next test that you are going to see on test day? It's the same one every time. It's always second. There's 60 questions in 60 minutes. It's the math test. All right, so math is always second. Now you get a calculator for every single question on the math test. You'll notice here that you have an average quick math question here. If there's 60 questions in 60 minutes, on average, how long do you have to spend per question? Well, you get 1 minute per question on average. Now, this does not mean that you are going to not need to spend 1.5 minutes on some questions, spend less time on another. So the questions do get progressively more advanced as you move through the math test. So those first 10 questions, you'll probably move through a little bit faster than the last 10 questions. The math test includes, you can see the topics that are covered here, number and quantity, algebra, geometry, both plane geometry and coordinate geometry, functions, stats, as well as some kind of data and integration. So as you get towards the back end of the test, you're going to see questions that may ask you to integrate multiple math topics. You'll also start to see some more advanced math there. It only goes up to pre-calculus. You'll see a couple of trig questions on the test. You will not see any calculus questions on the test. So for better or for worse, for those of you who love calculus or hate calculus, or don't even know what it is, that's fine. You will see a good percentage of questions on geometry as well as algebra. So those are going to be the 2 kind of heavy hitter targets on test day. In fact, we are going to look at a concept from both of those math topics right now. Now, when you're dealing with a quadratic equation, and go ahead, you can give me an example of a quadratic equation down there in the chat. You might be asked a couple of things. You might be asked to solve a quadratic equation. You might also be asked to factor a quadratic equation, or you might be asked to provide the roots of a quadratic equation. Now, if you have 2 binomials and you need to create a quadratic equation, you'll use a FOIL. This stands for first, outer, inner, last. So for instance, if I have these 2 binomials, I can FOIL them out to get a quadratic by looking at those first terms. There we go, x times x. Looking at those outer terms, x times negative 3x. Those inner terms, 2x. Now notice the outer and the inner will combine to give you just negative x. And then those last terms will give negative 6. So the outer and the inner combine, and now we have a quadratic. And this is in that form of ax squared plus bx plus c, of your standard form of a quadratic equation. Now to go the other way, we're going to reverse FOIL, or factor. So I've got another one here. Now, when you reverse FOIL, you are looking for 2 factors of your C term that sum to B. And remember, I gave our example of ax squared plus bx plus c. That's kind of your standard equation of a quadratic. I'm seeing some other good ones here in the chat. Yeah, so all of these, so anytime you have that x squared, that's going to give you a quadratic equation. So in this case, I want 2 factors of 6 that will sum to 5. Now, for this example here, you might just be able to look at it and say like, oh, I can just look at this one and I can think of 2 factors of 6 that add to 5. But if you don't, you can always do what we call a factor T. You can come on over here and you can draw out, factors of 6, and you can say, all right, well, 1 goes into 6 times. All right, 1 plus 6 does not equal 5. 2 goes into 6 3 times. Hey, 2 plus 3, that is going to give me 6. So now we can say, all right, x plus 2 and x plus 3. As Aria and Coleman have given us there in the chat. I see a couple others of you have given us that as well. Now, we have not solved this quadratic equation. What you've done here is you have factored it. If you've been asked to solve it, you'd actually need to set each of these binomials equal to 0. So to solve this, these solutions would actually be -2 and -3. Because if I set x plus 2 equal to 0, x would be -2. If I set x plus 3 equal to 0, then x would be -3. So you always need to pay attention to what the question specifically is asking you to do. In fact, take that hint with you into question number 3. Joe's got that poll open. Answer below. And so the first thing we want to do here is if we want to find, hey, look at this. We want the sum of the 2 solutions. The first thing we have to do is solve it. Now, there are other ways to do this. I saw some questions like, well, do we have to do it this way? Can we do it some other way? Yeah, you can use the quadratic equation. You could complete the square. I mean, you can use other ways to factor this one. In this case, I'm looking for 2 factors of -56 that sum to x. Now, because I'm looking for -56, I know that at least I know that one of my numbers, exactly one of them, will be negative and exactly one of them will be positive. So we can say, all right, reverse FOIL, 2 factors of 56, well, -7 and +8 will multiply to give me -56 and will add or sum to give me +1. So I know that I have the 2 binomials. Now I need to solve this. So I'm going to set each of these equal to 0. X minus 7 equals 0. Well, that means that x equals 7. X plus 8 equals 0. Well, that means that x equals -8. Now I am looking at the poll, and I know we were leaning towards answer choice E. And we also are kind of like answer choice B. But, this question wants the sum of the 2 solutions. So if you're like, I don't know, do I pick B or E? Neither one. You've got to add the 2 of them together to get -1, and that's going to give us answer choice C. Notice how if you had summed just the factoring numbers, you would have gotten answer choice D. B and E were the roots. If you ended up with answer choice A, you got to find an error somewhere along the way. Right, so you'll see quadratics on test day. You'll also see some plane geometry, and here is, if you don't have a favorite shape, the most frequently tested shape that you'll see on test day. That is the triangle. So go ahead and tell me in the chat, what do you know about triangles? I'm going to harness some of that information right here. Here is the number 1 thing to know about triangles, other than like what they are. Right? They got 3 sides, they got 3 angles, and those angles always add up to 180 degrees, those interior angles. Now we can find the area of the triangle with this equation right here. You are given this formula at the front of that math test, but have it locked away in your brain. You'll be much more likely to use it if you've already memorized it. You also will save some time. You won't have to flip back and find it. Other things we know about a triangle. Well, we can also, when you're dealing with a right triangles being one that has a 90-degree angle, we can use the Pythagorean theorem, which says that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So here's my right triangle. So there's my right angle. So c is always the hypotenuse, and you have sides a and b. So this gives you the kind of ratios of the sides in a right triangle. I'm seeing some other things here. You have an equilateral triangle, absolutely, if they all added up to 60. They're going to have 3 sides, they're going to have 3 angles. Yeah, exactly. And I'm seeing Caustic is pointing out the triangle inequality theorem, which is that the sum of any 2 sides, or in fact, any one side, has to be less than the sum of the other side. And of course, we can also apply trig to these right triangles as well. Now, one thing to note, the Pythagorean theorem is going to be like your best bud on test day when it comes to triangles. Save yourself some time by recognizing some of these Pythagorean triplets, like 3, 4, 5, 5, 12, 13, as well as their multiples. That'll save you some time without having to actually do the Pythagorean theorem a whole ton of times. All right, it's time to apply some of just those triangle concepts to a test-like question. Once again, I'm going to give you about a minute for question number 4. Poll is open below. All right, let's take a look at this one. So we're looking for the measurement of the smallest angle. We have a whole bunch of x's here. So the first thing we have to remind ourselves is, well, what do we know about triangles generally? And we know that, as Eric says, if you add all these angles up, they're going to equal 180 degrees. So we can say, all right, I know that this angle plus this angle plus this angle are going to give me 180 degrees total, and that's going to allow you to solve for x. So once you've set that up, now you can combine your like terms, do some basic algebra, subtract 33 from both sides, divide both sides by 7, and now we know that x equals 21. Now be careful, because I see a lot of us are being tempted by answer choice A here. This question didn't ask us for x, right? This question asked us for the measurement of the smallest angle. Well, x is not the smallest angle. In fact, the smallest angle, if we look over here, is going to be this one right here, right? X plus 2. So now that we know x, we can plug that into the small angle. We can, in fact, solve for the smallest angle measurement, which is going to be 23 degrees. All right, so that's how you would break this down. 100, when in doubt, 180. 180 degrees in a triangle will save you every day. Okay, let's move on to that next section, that test you're going to see after the break. So after the math test, you're going to get that 5-minute break, and then you're moving on to the reading test. Now go ahead and tell me in the chat, what do you find to be the most challenging aspect of the reading test? You're going to have 35 minutes for this test. There's 4 passages with 10 questions apiece, which means you have just a little bit under 9 minutes for each passage. Now, when I usually ask what challenges do you tend to face, overwhelmingly, students say, kind of what Coleman is saying here, like, oh, reading. And when I was in your shoes, back when I was in high school, I didn't like the reading test so much either. It's not because I didn't like reading. I loved reading. In fact, I was a voracious reader. But I felt like I didn't understand what the test makers wanted me to do. I felt like there were multiple ways to interpret it, and I never knew exactly which interpretation was right. I felt like I was like torn between 2 different options a lot of times, and I felt like it was very subjective. Now, a lot of you mentioning here the timing as well, right? It goes pretty quickly. You've got to be moving right along. So if you're wondering, what should I do? Should I read the questions first or should I read the passage first? I'm going to give you the definitive answer right here. Read the passage first. Now, that's only going to be effective if you know what to look for. Because if you don't know what to look for, you're going to spend a lot of time just reading and you're not going to know what to do. However, the ACT is a standardized test, which means that even though the passages will differ from test to test, what you're being tested on and how you approach it is still standardized. You're asked about the same types of information and the same types of elements in any passage, regardless of what the actual words are saying. So you can, in fact, know exactly what to look for as you read the passage without seeing the questions, because the questions are always going to ask you basically the exact same thing. Now, with that in mind, you're going to get 4 different types of passages, but like I say, the same techniques apply every single time. In fact, one of the number one things that we cover in our in-depth reading session is, what do you look for? What should you read and try to identify the first time, so that when you get to the questions, you're like, oh, hey, I already thought about this. I've already actually answered this one in my brain. I can just, do this question and move on. You end up spending about roughly 4.5 minutes maybe on the passage, and then you spend the rest of the time on the questions, and they can move quite quickly. Now, it's not so much skimming, but in fact, just skimming over the non-important details and focusing in on the elements that give you, that will eventually be asked about with regard to the questions. So things that the questions always ask about, author's main idea. Why did the author write this? What's the purpose? What's the point of view? A detail only matters if it is elaborate. In fact, details really don't matter. Evidence matters. What is the author using to support his or her point of view? Transitions and turning points matter. And you might get a large amount of details about a particular thing, and you're like, oh, well, this is a paragraph about this thing. This is the history paragraph. This is the paragraph about how windows are made. You don't need to focus on all the nitty-gritty details. You may also be asked about inferences, again, from the text itself. An inference is just something that must be true based on what you read. And finally, you're going to be asked about the author's voice. So if you're focusing on main idea, point of view, and areas of transition, you're in fact in great shape to move on to those questions without having to do a ton of rereading. And like I say, again, we have sessions that break down each of these components, as well as how to break down the passage itself in a lot of detail in the full online prep live product. Now, when we're talking about breaking down the passage, you want to be focusing on the main point of the passage, as well as the main point of each paragraph. Tell me in the chat, where can you find the main point of a paragraph? Hopefully. Assuming that this author, like you ought to be on the English test, and if you're taking that optional writing test, doing in your own writing. The main point of the entire passage is going to be kind of like woven throughout the whole passage itself. So while you might get a thesis statement for like the science passage, for the humanities and the social studies, and certainly for the prose fiction passage, you're not going to get a thesis statement where the author says, in this passage, I'm going to tell you about X, Y, and Z. But you will see kind of an underlying current throughout the entire passage that everything builds towards. You can almost think of the main point as the top of the pyramid, like the main point's up here, and everything else, all the body, is going to support that main element. Now, for each paragraph, you should be able to quickly distill the main idea with the topic sentence, or Nikki calls it the first sentence, or yeah, the beginning. Exactly. So you're looking at that topic sentence and you're like, aha, this is the paragraph that's going to do this. When we're talking about, when we describe this, what we call this active reading, passage mapping, many students think that annotating is a summarization activity, that we're saying, well, you should read the paragraph or you should read the passage and then be like, what did I just read about? Let me think about it. Let me put it in my own words. But that's not it at all. In fact, if you're finding that you're having trouble with timing, it may be because you're spending too much time summarizing rather than using the words the author has given you to anticipate what's coming next. If you read a topic sentence about a paragraph that introduces something like, this thing is very important, then you're going to be like, oh, this paragraph is going to tell me about the importance of this thing. You already know that. So now you've got to skim over some of those details because you already know the main essence, the big takeaway of that particular paragraph until you hit a transition word or some other turning point. Now, you'll also need to make inferences from the passage. And like I said, this isn't explicitly stated, but this is something that must be true based on what you read. It's got to be true. It could be true. It might be true. It has got to be true based on what you have read. So let's apply some active reading to this passage right here. And Eric, I'm going to walk through this right now. So we're going to actively read this together. So when you're active reading, the first thing you want to do, always read the blurb. The blurb is superb. I actually cannot claim credit for that statement, although it's true. That is from one of my students who's like, the blurb is superb. It absolutely is. Tells you what you're going to learn about. So we're going to read about handedness in animals. All right. So we already know the big topic. That's not what this is. I mean, it is what it's about. We're going to say, okay, what specifically about handedness in vertebrates is this author discussing? So the first thing we're going to do here is start reading. Now, I'm going to stop after the first 3 words. In the past. I have only read 3 words of this passage, but tell me in the chat, what do you anticipate this paragraph is going to include? In the past, blah, blah, blah. What's the author going to follow up with? What does the phrase in the past suggest is coming next? Right, so if you're like, well, if in the past, now we can keep reading. In the past, the scientific consensus was that these functions of the brain are responsible for certain tasks. Then we can anticipate that this has probably changed, right? This is what happened beforehand, and now this is no longer true. This was true in the past, but as Declan says, something has evolved over time. Yes, and now we're expecting it to have changed. So there was a scientific consensus, probably isn't right, right? So now we can say 90% of all humans are right-handed. All right, so we've got a detailed fact here implying that the dominant hemisphere is on the left side. Okay. Now, so here we have right away, we're like, all right, if in the past, I bet, if it was uniquely human, I bet it's probably no longer just humans, right? It's probably now not entirely unique to humans. Maybe other animals can do this too. Now, we also have the author says clearly. Tell me in the chat, when would you use the word clearly? Clearly, there's some kind of genetic disposition involving this separation. So when we have a transition word like this, you want to kind of take note of how the author would use it. If I'm going to say like clearly, I'm going to say like this is obvious. I'm emphasizing this point. So we have 2 notions here. We know that in the past, the scientific consensus with this was uniquely human. It's probably not a consensus that it only happens with humans now. But we do know that there's definitely some sort of genetic component to this, obviously, right? Emphasizing it. So now we're like, I wonder if this is also in animals. What do you suspect? Let's hedge your bets. Yes, this author is going to find it in animals, or no, This author is not going to find it in animals. What do you think? How can you use your passage mapping abilities already to see into the future what this author is going to write about? Well, if in the past it was only thought to be human, let's find out if it's now animals also. Seeing a lot of yeses come in here. All right. The evidence that this occurs in all vertebrates is mounting. Oh my gosh. We were right. We didn't even have to read the next paragraph to pretty much know that that's the conclusion the author was coming to. Like, awesome for us, but see how this is an anticipatory exercise? We're not summarizing. We actually know where the author is going to go because we're paying attention to how these words are strung together. So evidence is mounting. However, all right, however is a contrast. No animal shows an extreme preference of humans. So it was thought to be uniquely human, right? Because like 90% of humans did this. It's actually animals too, yes, but humans still like do this the most extremely. Okay? And now the author maybe gives us some examples and evidence of this. The author is like, well, it's probably because of tools and maybe some other factors. You know, if you're looking at this, you might say, all right, so it's everywhere humans have it the most. And the other like is why. So this is kind of like giving us the why. You know, it's like, all right, it's genes and it's tools. These are probably the reasons that humans show it the most extreme. But yes, animals do it too. Now notice how we have taken this, you know, these two paragraphs. This is some pretty dense scientific study. And we can distill it into like two easily digestible sentences. Humans have an extreme preference for handedness. They didn't think animals did it, but they do. That's basically it. Now, using that, let's move on to some of these questions. And let's see how, having read the passage first and focusing in on these right elements, how quickly you can move through these questions. What's the main point of this passage? Go ahead and answer in the poll, and then I want you, after you've answered in the poll, to tell me in the chat what you would predict. If I asked you, without looking at these answer choices, what is the main point of the passage, what would you tell me? Go ahead, tell Kieran and Katie. Go ahead and tell Arthur and Joe. And of course, Beth, because Beth is reading every single one of your responses that come in here through the chat. All right, I'm seeing those poll results come in. Tell me in the chat, what in your own words, and again, these don't have to be fancy words. They can be like really basic. How would you describe the main point? I described it as handedness in humans a lot, but also animals, genetic, maybe tools. All right. I'm loving that we are leaning so close to answer choice B here. The specialization has a complex origin. Well, it's about this handedness separation. It's about why humans show it the most. Tools, also genetics, lots of stuff going on. Now, let's look at some of these wrong answer choices. Brain chemistry, I didn't read anything about brain chemistry at all. Maybe it is crucial to understand. I don't know, because we didn't read about that. So we can't select that as an answer choice if we didn't read about it. Genetic factors account for little, if any. Opposite alert. No, the author actually says it's like probably the genetics, right? Obviously, it's genetics. So that's like the opposite of little, if any. And all members of the 8 family show either right or left-handedness. Well, I mean, you only have 2 hands, so like that's a logical conclusion. But that was not the main idea of the passage. This author was not like, did you know that every single ape either uses their right hand or their left hand? Like, okay, as opposed to what? No, this was about like the genetic handedness and is it animals or is it humans and what causes it to be so extreme in humans. So when you're dealing with a main point, this is why it's so crucial to answer kind of this question up here first. Because if you're like, well, this main point is about the dominance of the brain hemispheres in humans. It's not unique, but humans show it the most extreme, as Miguel has said. RS is the dominance of brain hemispheres, but vertebrates show similar traits. Notice how if you had made that prediction, you wouldn't be like, oh, yep, every ape and human uses either the right or left hand. Like, that doesn't match up with that prediction at all, but it definitely matches up with answer choice B. And that's how you can quickly move through these reading questions that ask about these kind of big concept ideas. Let's look at a question that asks us for something a bit more specific with question number 13. This is wanting an inference. Now remember, an inference must be true. Now, I know in the real world, often we talk about inferences as being educated guesses, and in real life, you absolutely do use your history and your experience in the past and your overall knowledge to connect ideas and to then, think what logically will happen next. On the ACT, though, an inference is what must be true based on what you read. So no species has ever displayed what? All right, go ahead and answer the poll, and then we'll break this one down. And after you've answered in the poll, again, I want you to get ready in the chat to give me your proof. What words or sentence or what concept from the passage proves this to you? All right, I'm looking down here at the poll, and I see we're not liking A at all. Like a preference for left-handedness, well, just because humans favor right-handedness doesn't mean that no species ever has a preference for left-handedness, because we did not actually learn about every species ever. D is also not getting a lot of the ability to change handedness. That wasn't mentioned again at all. So we can eliminate that one right there. So we're kind of torn here between, not even really torn, but we're definitely only kind of favoring either one of these. A preference for using both hemispheres equally. Again, we didn't really see anything about equality here. The author didn't mention it. But I like what Luke says. B almost quotes the paragraph. So let's look at answer choice B. Let's prove it. A 95% preference for right-handedness. So we're going to do a little bit of connection here. Who has the most extreme handedness preferences? Humans are the most extreme, right? The author says this a lot. Humans favor right-handedness more than any other animal. But what percentage of humans favor right-handedness? About 90%. So if humans are the most extreme, and the most extreme is 90%, well, that means that's not 95%. Right? So that is how we can make an inference. Notice how these are both facts that were provided in the passage. If you combine these two facts together, you can see how, well, if 90% is the most extreme, then no species has displayed 95%. And that is anchored there in the text. We didn't actually have to go and think outside the box or read between the lines or do any of that type of stuff. We basically just have to do, as Grace said, connect with ideas. I love the way you worded that, Grace. Humans are the most extreme and have 90%, so no species would have more. Done. Circle B, move on. And in our case, we're going to go on to that last multiple choice test that you're going to see on test day, which is science. Science, also, you got to move pretty quickly, just like you did on reading. It's also 35 minutes long. There are 7 passages with varying numbers of questions, between kind of 5 and 7, over 40 questions total. You're going to have, on average, 5 minutes to spend on each passage, although, again, some passages you might move a little more quickly through. Others might take you a little bit longer. You're going to, see biology, chemistry, or science, but you are not being tested on your content knowledge, right? You do not have to have taken, advanced biology or earth science or physics to do well on the science test. A lot of times students will describe this, and I kind of like to describe it as well. This is a reading test with charts, graphs, and figures. There's a lot of charts, graphs, and figures, but you are still just interpreting what's there provided to you, just like you do on the reading test, as opposed to, say, having to have memorized a whole bunch of science facts and then, regurgitate them here on the ACT. So almost every single question can be answered using information from the passage. You will, however, need to understand how an experiment works, which is you do need to understand what the purpose is of a given experiment, what their results are, things like independent and dependent variables. So there's those variables. You should also be able to recognize variables and patterns from a chart, graph, or table. And apply scientific reasoning. And the scientific reasoning, this is like knowing how experimental design works. Right? So you can only change one independent variable at a time. You have to potentially have a control group. So if this is the scientific reasoning that you are tested on is part of the curriculum that you took for whatever science class was required by your school to graduate. So you have learned this. A lot of you probably learned it in like a 9th grade general science. You may have seen it in some other science class that you've taken later on. But if you are like on track to graduate from your school, you will have taken a science class that covers the scientific reasoning that you need to have for test day. And like all our tests, we dig deep into each of these topics in our full lessons at Online Prep Live. So let's talk about some variables. Go ahead and tell me in the chat, what is an independent variable? What is a dependent variable? How can you identify one over the other? So just like our independent clauses can stand alone, independent variables are going to be what we can control. So the independent variable is what you can manipulate. So you manipulate the independent variable, which is usually on the x-axis, not always, but usually. And the dependent variable is what is measured, and that is often on the y-axis. The exception here would be if you're dealing with something like altitude or depth, but it just makes more sense to show altitude and depth going like vertically because they're vertical elements. Otherwise, you're going to see your independent variable kind of on the x-axis. I love it. So the dependent variable changes based on the independent variable. Yep, that is our x to y relationship. I'm seeing a lot of you, in fact, use the word manipulate for independent variable. Yes, nice, absolutely. Okay, fantastic. Now, sometimes if you're having trouble figuring out what is manipulated, look at what is measured first, and this will be provided for you, in the text as well. The units are going to show how quickly each variable changes. When you're dealing with a chart, graph, or figure, look for those hash marks. Don't assume that each tick mark equals 1. Maybe they're not uniform. So those are just something to kind of pay attention to as you're moving through. And the trend is kind of the general direction of that information. Does x go up as y go up? Is it kind of increasing? Does x go down as y go down? Is there like no relationship at all? And could you continue that graph beyond what's shown? There's no surprises here on this science test. If you have a graph that's doing this, off the page, it's going to continue to do that. It's not going to suddenly be like, oh, just kidding, surprise. It goes, no. Like you can just continue whatever trend is happening off the table. Now, let's look at this here. So tell me in the chat, what is our independent variable? What is our dependent variable? Well, in this case, we can just go right over here to our x-axis. I'm going to say, all right, x-axis, temperature. So we are manipulating temperature. That is our independent variable. Our dependent variable is over here on the y-axis. We are measuring solubility. And then we also, look at this. We also have all these other things here. Sugar, all these other compounds that you don't have to know how to pronounce them at all. You can call it KNO3. You can call it KNO for all that it matters on test day. But what are these? Because I see we have temperature as independent. I'm looking in the chat. I like it. We have solubility as dependent. But what are all those things I highlighted in pink? Sugar, sodium, our nitrates, our KNOs, and our NA, our stuff. These are also, in fact, independent variables. So we can't really compare two of them at once, but we can definitely pick which solute we're testing at any given time, right? We can test sugar, we can test KNO3, we can test something else. We get to pick it, right? So that makes it independent as well. So they would be considered an independent variable in this case. And that only means that in this case, you wouldn't be able to say compare this point right here with that point right here, because there are two different temperatures and two different solvents or solutes in this case. So we could compare, say, like this point and this point. I could say at 30 degrees, sugar is more soluble than whichever this one is here, right? NABR. But I wouldn't be able to compare, two different solutes and two different temperatures at the same time. So that's why it's important to recognize where these things are. Now let's look at our units. Here our units are Celsius, all right? And we got each tick mark is like 20. What are our units over here? I see, again, each bar is like 40, but we're dealing with grams of solute per, so I'm gonna go like tilt your head over here. I'm doing the same thing, so don't worry about it, per 100 grams of water. All right, and of course we also see an equation here. So I got it, okay, grams per 100. Now I do want to give a shout out to what I saw earlier. Schwark made a great comment about dry mix, that acronym to remember where these are. Dependent response y-axis, manipulated independent x-axis. Very cool. I like it. Now when we're dealing, so here we've already done this. There's our temperature, there's our units, there's our trends. This is the one I didn't ask you about. We can see here that most of these go up. For which one of these do we not? Let's see, sugar goes up. Yep, it goes up. This one goes up. So up, 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 up. Okay, this one goes down. So I might put like a little mark there to be like, wait, that's an exception. All right, that's an exception. You might do something like that on test day just to be like, okay, most of them, as temp goes up, solubility goes up, but these other two down here are our exceptions. All right, let's look at a question. I want to give you a couple seconds to do this one on your own. I want you, here's my hint, to pay close attention to the units. See if that helps you catch yourself from a tempting wrong answer. Okay, so let's start with the parts of this that we know, because we're kind of like all over the map for this one, right? So let's break it down. Well, first off, we're looking at NaNO3. So, okay, boom, I'm looking at this one right here. And I'm looking at 90 degrees. Okay, that I'm going to, so 90 is going to be between 100 and 80, right? So there we go. Or I'm going to put, let me move this over. I'm going to put a little line here at 90 degrees so we can see it. So I'm like, okay, boom, right there. That is the point I care about. Right? And if I kind of go over, if I walk myself over to solubility, I can see that this gives me 160. So at 90 degrees Celsius, 160 grams of NaNO3 will dissolve in 100 grams of water. Now, I know it's 100 grams because my units told me. Right? That's grams per 100. So if you got to answer choice D, I want you to tell yourself, good job, me. I read this graph correctly. I found 90 degrees. I went to NaO3. I went over and I read this graph correctly. Give yourself credit for that. But hold up. What does this question want? Because I know we're leaning towards D, but the red pen's got to come out. We got to cross it out. No. Kristen, the label says 100 grams, but the question says 25. Cyber high five. Absolutely. Torque says you got to divide by 4. And that's exactly what you got to do. We want 25 grams, not 100. Divide that by 4, and you're going to end up with B, which is 40 grams. There you go. We had to use the units that were provided here. We didn't want 100 grams of water. We wanted 25. So if we, quarter that, we're only going to have a quarter of that remaining. Nicely done. This is a high difficulty question, in fact. So I know we've been talking a lot about, this is just a taste of ACT Online Prep Live. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about what is included and covered in the full product. So what you get access to here, and of course you can continue to ask your questions to Kieran and Katie, Joe, Arthur, of course Beth is reading everything here. You get official ACT practice tests and practice questions from ACT itself. You have both live instruction, just like what we did right here. In fact, yesterday I was teaching sessions of ACT Online Prep Live right here, just like this, to students just like you, although we were digging deep into a particular topic. Tomorrow, my colleague Eli is going to go into some reading and some statistics and some probability. Of course, you can also rewatch. We have on demand, so if you need to access some material, you want to see it again or just slow it down, you can access those recordings at any time as well. You're also going to get a personalized study plan that incorporates kind of the work that you're doing and then suggests the best next steps for you to take. So you don't have to say, oh, I'm going to study for the ACT. That's a pretty big pie to eat all at once, right? Break it down bite by bite. And it says, okay, you in fact should study this particular type of question here for math. You should study this particular type of element here, rather than just saying, well, I need to study generally. And all of your instruction is, oh, this is going to make me blush, is taught by Kaplan's best and brightest ACT experts, both on camera as well as off camera. You'll notice here that I am not the only expert here with you. In fact, right now you have, let me see if I can count us up, six ACT experts all here to answer your questions. On any given ACT Online Prep Live session, you'll have at a minimum 3. So there's always expertise both on camera and off to help you there in the chat. You also have access to discussion forums that are moderated and questioned even outside of a class that are answered by additional ACT experts from Kaplan. I do want to point out that if you qualify for a fee waiver, if you are taking the ACT for free because of a fee waiver, you do get ACT Online Prep Live for free as well. So make sure that when you register for the test, you add this in as well. A couple other things, 2,400 practice questions. You will never be lacking for material to study with. There are 2 full-length official ACT practice tests from ACT, as well as 4 short ACT tests that cover each of those test sections, so you can get some practice there. In fact, use this as a diagnostic to help you figure out where to study. Azita says, so are there also study questions? Yes, there are. So in addition to the questions we do here in class, in our sessions, in fact, at the end of every single session, I suggest where to find the homework, and all of us do, right? We all suggest where to go find additional practice questions. So for instance, if we had just finished up that science lesson on units and variables, and you wanted to find additional practice questions that just focused on that, we would tell you exactly where to go from the practice tab in your Online Prep Live homepage so you could access just those types of questions to use. Now, of course, the value of this is that it is live. So in addition to getting access to all this material, you also get access to live instructors, right? You can ask questions and then get them answered immediately, right? Instant gratification on that. And we really do dig deep into this. Our classes are structured on weeknights as well as weekends. So around that school schedule so that you're able to fit those in. They are most frequently offered from 7 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern on weeknights and variable times there on the weekends. And of course, you also have access to on demand. So if there's a session you want to attend, but you can't, not to worry, you can still, of course, get all of that information there as well. And now here's another thing we want to talk about. In addition to the content, we also dig into some of these more kind of study skill related areas. Test day is in fact like coming up this week. So yesterday, I moderated a session that was just on test anxiety, and students could just come in, ask their questions. We all kind of did a little bit of like, test stress catharsis. But we also have sessions on goal setting, on time management, on setting your study schedule, on kind of the right attitude to have to keep yourself accountable. And like I mentioned, there's those moderated forums as well. You have those practice test results that are customized to you. Basically, it's everything that you would need before test day. Like I say, led by Kaplan's talk experts here. In fact, it is Kristen leading a lesson right there. You can see here on one of those on-demand lessons right there. And then, of course, our off-camera teachers like Arthur and Katie and Kieran and Joe and Beth that you've been chatting with, here in the chat. You also have those off-camera there as well. All right, so Nisha asked a great question. Can I get access if I just do a 6-week subscription? Yes, let me talk a bit more about how to register for this and what some of those subscriptions are. So you can access this, first off, if you have not registered for the ACT. When you go to register, you can bundle it right there at that time and get it there. If you've already registered for the ACT, you can just get this separately. You don't have to get, if you've already registered for the October test, you don't have to register for a different test just to get this. You can add this on. And if you already have ACT online prep, which does not include the live component, but just has the questions, you can upgrade to the live component with an upgrade option there. So here are the normal subscription prices for today's event. You do have some of those promo codes there, so I do want to leave this up here. A 6-week subscription, this is fantastic if you're prepping for that October test. It gives you access to everything as much times as you want, unlimited for 6 weeks. 12 weeks if you're looking to prep for like the December test, you can get 20% off of that, and that's going to give you again access for 12 weeks. 24 weeks if you're thinking about prepping for some of those spring tests, you want to space it out a little bit more, use the code EVENT, and that is going to give you 25% off of that discount right there. So if you're looking to do this, you can, I'll show you how. Just you look right below, you've got that order now button, and that will allow you to, really give you guidance, help you put your best foot forward when it comes to the ACT. And like I said, if you've already registered for it, you can log into your ACT.org account and you can upgrade from there. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back up here on the screen. I'll answer some of your questions, even though I know that Kieran, Katie, Arthur, Joe, and Beth are also doing that. Short says, how many free practice tests do we get? There are 2 full-length practice tests as well as 4 short form tests. So, and then of course, then you also have an enormous question bank that you have access to as well. So you can set yourself, like you can do 10 question quizzes, things like that if you'd like, or you can just space them out with your study time. I think that may have been. So Eric says, can I sign up for the website and get the practice test? Absolutely. You can just look below. That's that order now button. And you can, in fact, if you sign up tonight, you can prep with Eli tomorrow. So, or you can access those on-demand lessons tonight if you'd like. So like I say, tomorrow night, Eli is talking about statistics and probability. He'll also be teaching about those English type questions that deal more with kind of style and organization. For those of you who are prepping for future tests, over on, let's see, and starting next weekend, we'll begin kind of another round for prepping for the October test, beginning with my wonderful colleague, Heather. Chilindra mentions about the fee waiver. So this would be something that you likely already have on file with your school or your school counselor. A good way to know is if you qualify for free or reduced lunches, you do likely qualify for a fee waiver as well. Of course, this depends on the district. I know, for instance, like New York City public schools have announced that like everyone gets free lunch. So in that case, it doesn't quite coordinate with the fee waiver there. But that is something that you'd have those forms filled out with your school counselor's office, and then that would allow you to both get a fee waiver for the ACT and also, therefore, get a fee waiver for ACT Online Prep Live. All right, Nikki says, how do I access the older videos? So if you are talking about those on-demand lessons from Online Prep Live, it's there in your homepage. There's a whole tab that says just recorded lessons, and you'd be able to access them there. And Karen says, yep. So once you're registered, they're all there available for you. Just like scroll down and access them. And yes, if you have ACT Online Prep, you have access to the questions, but you don't have access to the live instruction. So that's ACT Online Prep Live as opposed to ACT Online Prep. It's a little bit of a kind of like one word difference there. ACT Kaplan Online Prep Live because Kaplan is of course doing all that live instruction. All right, looks like questions have slowed up. So if you do have any further ones, feel free to continue to reach out to my fantastic colleagues. On behalf of myself and Arthur, Joe, Kieran, Katie, Beth, our digital media expert, Chris, and all of us here at Kaplan and ACT, we want to wish you the best of luck as you prep, particularly those of you taking the test this weekend. For those of you who are have been affected by Harvey or Irma, definitely do check the ACT.org website to see if your testing center has been postponed. I know if you're in Florida, a lot of you may in fact find that your test date has been rescheduled. So double check for that. It's right there on the website. That's I know there were some questions about that. And otherwise, good luck with your prep, and we hope to see you in one of our online prep live sessions really soon. Take care, everyone.